everybody. I am Tatiana Bazzichelli, the director of the Disruption Network Club, and I'm very happy to welcome everybody at the second day of Borders of Fear. Together with me, there is the team of the Disruption Network Club that has been working hard to make this conference possible, and I want to thank them, the people that work with us every day. There is, of course, the co-director, Lieke Plucher, that is working to develop this great program together now since 2 years. And we have Elena Velianowska and Nada Baker for the production, Jonas Franchi for the designer, and Anna Travers for the communication. So I really want to thank them all because we really, especially in this time of lockdown, I've been working a lot for making this program of this year with all the conference that we needed to do. So thanks a lot, this great team that we have. And I also want to say that, of course, we are in a very special situation because we are during a lockdown in Germany. So we decided to do our conference at the Kunstquartier Bethanien as a live studio, but all the audience is following online. So I also take the opportunity to thank everybody that is following us, and we will imagine that you are with us in this room that looks quite empty, but you know, we are also in a virtual world, so I will imagine that you are all with us. And of course, I want to thank our funders that made this conference series possible this year, and all our cooperation partners that you can see on the screen behind me. So today, as I say, we are at the second day of the conference. Yesterday, we were having an intense program speaking about what does it mean to create borders, and the borders are both mental borders, but also physical borders. We were speaking about the discourse of persecution and border control, and what is the system that are around all these machinery that many people are experiencing at a global level. And today we want to hear directly the voice of the migrants and refugees themselves to reflect collectively on form of social justice. So I'm very happy to have with us a very special person, that is Josef Zemikael Affeworki, that will be later with us, and Sally Hayden and Amber Schutz to speak about his personal experience, but also not his own, the experience of many people. And at the same time, today we are discussing on the political aspect of borders and the technological implication of the use of surveillance, for example, and all the form of artificial intelligence and control that are possible through technology. So this will be the second panel of the day. And of course, we also want to discuss about the narrative around migration, especially in the context of media, and also the context of the way the migrants are portrayed in this media. And in this kind of discussion, also I want to mention that as Disruption Network Club, we have a particular policy that we have been also sharing with our speakers, and we want to share with the audience. So we are asking everybody of not showing photos of people face in situation of forced migration or humanitarian setting without their express and ongoing consent. And of course, there are special cases in which this material was important for exposing truths and also evidence, so was necessary to show, but for sure we also want to be strong on this fact because we have all the responsibility of understanding how to veiculate these topics and also respect the people that we are speaking about. So we want to start also with the first part of the event. That is a very interesting investigation from Petra Molnar. We are going to show a video. Petra is not here, but we are very happy to have a contribution at this event. She's a lawyer and researcher on migration, technology, and human rights. And with the Refugee Law Lab and the European Digital Rights EDRi, she just released a report that is named Technological Testing Ground. And this report is documenting the human rights impact of migration management experiments. Petra is co-creating the Migration and Technology Monitor Collective that is documenting the use of surveillance technology and artificial intelligence at crossing borders. And this presentation is accompanied by photos that are taken in Lesbos in Greece by Kenya-Jade Pinto during a research visit in September 2020. So now I will leave to you the contribution by Petra, and then we will come back with the first panel of the day. Thank you.
We are black and border guards hate us. Their computers hate us too. These are the words of Adisu, a young man from Eritrea living in Brussels without immigration status, who spoke with me in July 2020 and whose permission I have to share his words with you today. Racism, technology, and borders create a cruel intersection as states are increasingly turning to novel techniques to manage migration. Across the globe, an unprecedented number of people are on the move due to conflict, instability, environmental factors, and economic reasons. As a response to increased migration into the European Union over the last few years, many states and international organizations involved in migration control are exploring technological experiments in various domains such as border enforcement, decision-making, and data mining. These experiments range from big data predictions about population movements in the Mediterranean and Aegean seas, to automated decision-making in immigration applications, to artificial intelligence or AI lie detectors and risk scoring at European borders. These innovations are often justified under the guise of needing new tools to manage migration in novel ways. However, these technological experiments simply do not consider the profound human rights ramifications and real impacts on human lives. We have just published a new report, Technological Testing Grounds, which is based on over 40 conversations with refugees and people on the move like Adisu. Our report attempts to show that much of this innovation occurs without adequate governance mechanisms and does not account for the very real impacts on people's rights and lives. Our investigation supplements a new report on xenophobic discrimination and emerging digital technologies for immigration enforcement by Professor Tendai Achiume, the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Racism, Racial Discrimination, Xenophobia, and Related Intolerance. Both reports find that many countries are exploring technological experiments for the purposes of border enforcement, immigration decision-making, and surveillance, weaponizing these tools against communities historically made marginalized. These high-risk technological experiments exacerbate systemic racism and discrimination and lead to far-reaching harms within an already discretionary and violent system. Right now, very little regulation exists on the use of border technologies. Due to this free-for-all and the increasing reliance on the private sector to set the agenda, what has fallen by the wayside are the real harms that people experience at these sharp edges of this technological development. More and more, violent uses of technology push borders further afield, contributing to policies of border externalization and militarization. These policies have direct and dire consequences. Drownings in the Mediterranean, illegal pushbacks to Turkey and Libya, and the brutal detention and separation of children from their families at the US-Mexico border, facilitated by companies like Palantir Technologies and many others. Part of our work this summer and fall was based in Greece, on the frontiers of Fortress Europe, to try and understand how surveillance and automated technologies are being deployed in these technological testing grounds. The photos you are seeing were taken by my brilliant colleague Kenya-Jade Pinto during our visit to Lesbos, a Greek island close to the Turkish coast that has been the home of thousands of people over the last few years, including the notorious Moria camp which burnt down in September. Kenya-Jade and I traveled there to witness what was happening, to try and hold space for conversations around the birth of a new containment camp, and to begin interrogating how surveillance and migration management technology fits into the mix. Walking through the gates of the hastily constructed camp near Karatepe, Lesbos, it was hard to hear each other. The wind howled so loudly it made it difficult for us to breathe. This rocky outcropping is the newest site of containment on Europe's borders, one housing over 9,000 people displaced during a global pandemic, with no idea when or how they will be able to leave. We witnessed thousands of people being sequestered on a barren stretch of road without food or water, tear-gassed, and then being herded into a new camp hastily built on the grounds of an old shooting range on a windswept peninsula, where if you stretched out your hand on one of the roads, you could touch the sea. We entered the camp with a group of journalists and saw firsthand the inadequate living conditions, as well as the barbed wire facility keeping suspected COVID cases apart from everyone else. But you might be wondering, where does technology fit into this? Frontier countries like Greece, sometimes known as Europe's shield, act as testing grounds for new technologies and surveillance mechanisms. For example, in October 2019, new legal rules were adopted that regard the deployment of drones by the Hellenic police, including the use of drones in order to monitor migration in border regions both at sea and land crossings. In September 2020, Frontex also announced that it was piloting a new Aerostat maritime surveillance system, proudly using Greece as a testing ground. The current pandemic conditions must also not be discounted, as they will speed up and exacerbate the turn to technological solutions at the border. We are already seeing the border industry pushing for increased adoption of so-called contactless biometrics for, quote, regular travelers as a way to stop the spread of the pandemic. As governments move more and more towards biosurveillance to contain the spread of the COVID-19 pandemic, we will likely continue to see this increase in tracking projects and automated drones. And if previous use of technology is any indication, refugees and people crossing borders will be disproportionately targeted and negatively affected. Pandemic responses are always political, and refugees and people on the move have historically been tied to the spread of illness and disease. Sadly, COVID-19 is already being weaponized and used as a justification to keep people contained. It is also accelerating the growth of a migration management industry that now has yet another reason to thrive. Proposed pandemic tools such as virus-targeting robots, cell phone tracking, and AI-based thermal cameras can all be used against people crossing borders. Not only do these technological experiments violate the rights of the people on the move, these interventions themselves often do not live up to the promises and arguments used to justify them in the first place. This use of technology to manage and control migration, however, is also shielded from scrutiny because of its emergency nature. Various people in our interviews on Lesbos were very concerned about proposed screening and surveillance mechanisms to keep people contained, tracked, and managed, and the seeming normalization of surveillance in the aftermath of the Moria fire. Yet no one is exactly clear on how the next few months will shape up, particularly regarding increasing technological incursions, data collection, and surveillance. Along with big tech, big money is also involved in the management of borders, with private security companies making major inroads with lucrative contracts procured by governments for shiny new tech experiments presented as a way to strengthen border security in these troubled times. These technological experiments, however, also play up the us versus them mentality at the center of migration management policy. Sadly, instead of long-term, viable redistribution of resources across the EU and timely processing of people's asylum, turning to techno-solutionism and migration surveillance will only exacerbate deterrence mechanisms that are already so deeply embedded in the EU's migration strategy, most recently including in the new Migration Pact. Also, the basic protections that exist for more politically powerful groups like citizens that have access to mechanisms of redress and oversight are often not available to people crossing borders. The current global digital rights space also does not sufficiently engage with migration issues, at best only tokenizing the involvement from both migrants and groups working with this community. Ultimately, the primary purpose of the technologies used in migration management is to track, identify, and control those crossing borders, communities that have been historically treated as such. The issues around emerging technologies in the management of migration are not just about the inherent use of technology, but rather about how it is used and by whom, with states and private actors setting the stage for what is possible and which priorities matter. The data gathering inherent in the development of these technologies also includes the expansion of existing mass-scale databases that underpin these practices to sensitive data, especially biometrics. The implementation of an EU-wide, overarching and interoperable smart border management system is also imminent in the coming years. Such data and technology systems provide an enabling infrastructure for many automated decision-making projects with deep and systemic harmful implications. The development and deployment of migration management is ultimately about decision-making by powerful actors on communities with fewer resources and mechanisms of redress. Politics also cannot be discounted, as migration management is always inherently a political exercise. Migration data has long been politicized by states to justify greater interventions in support of threatened national sovereignty and to bolster xenophobic and anti-migrant narratives. The state's ultimate power to decide who is allowed to enter and under what conditions is strengthened by ongoing beliefs in technological impartiality. The unequal distribution of benefits from technological development privileges the private sector as the primary actor in charge of development, with states and governments wishing to control the flows of migrant populations benefiting from these technological experiments. Governments and large international organizations are the primary agents who benefit from data collection, and affected groups remain the subject, relegated to the margins. It is therefore not surprising that the regulatory and legal space around the use of these technologies remains murky and underdeveloped, full of discretionary decision-making, privatized development, and uncertain legal ramifications. These power and knowledge monopolies are allowed to exist precisely because there is no unified global regulatory regime governing the use of new technologies, creating laboratories for high-risk experiments with profound impacts on people's lives. This type of experimentation also foregrounds certain framings over others that prioritize certain types of interventions. For example, why are we catching liars at the border using AI versus catching racist border guards? Why is it a more urgent priority to deport people faster rather than use technological interventions to catch mistakes that are made in improperly refused immigration and refugee applications? The so-called AI divide, or the gap between those who are able to design AI and those who are subject to it, is broadening. It also highlights really problematic power dynamics in participation and agency when it comes to the rollout of new technologies. Because at the end of the day, maybe it's about broader, bigger questions. Who gets to participate in conversations around proposed interventions? Which communities become guinea pigs for testing new initiatives? Why does so little oversight and accountability exist in this opaque space of high stakes and high risk decision making? The human rights impacts of these state and private sector practices is a useful lens through which to examine these technological experiments, particularly in these times of greater border security and screening measures, this complex system of global migration management, the increasingly widespread criminalization of migration, and rising xenophobia. But we also have to ask ourselves, whose perspectives matter when talking about innovation and which priorities take precedence? What does critical representation and meaningful participation look like? Including the types of imagery that is used. Imagery that foregrounds people's agency and does not contribute to the poverty porn that is so common in representations coming from spaces of forced migration. Are human rights framings enough? Or do they actually silence the systemic and collective nature of these harms? Are we doing enough to create space for abolitionist conversations when it comes to technology at the border? Unfortunately, the viewpoints of those most affected are routinely excluded from the discussion, particularly around areas of no-go zones or ethically fraught usages of technology. There's a profound lack of contextual analysis when thinking through the impacts of new technologies resulting in greater ethical, social, political, and personal harm. The hubris of big tech and the allure of quick fixes do not address the systemic reasons why communities are marginalized and why people are forced to migrate in the first place. Technology replicates power structures in society. While conversations around the ethics of AI are taking place, ethics do not go far enough, as they are culturally coded and can be co-opted to silence collective and systemic harms that are actively being perpetuated. We need to recognize the very real risks and harms of technologies used to manage migration, often at the expense of human rights and human lives. This includes the abolition of migration management technologies at and around the border, technologies that exacerbate systemic racism, historical surveillance of communities routinely made marginalized, and creating a panopticon of control that catches people like Adisu in its violent grasp. Thank you so much.